Hi, this is Greg Hale, Senior Advisor with NYSERDA. I'm going to give you a presentation on our path to New York State's path to carbon neutral building stock in the middle of the century. Shylin Black, who's a Senior Green Building Plant for the City of Vancouver, will be presenting shortly at the end of my presentation. So I will get going and you'll hear from Shylin soon. You may be looking at a still photo of me today. We're having a little bit of connectivity issues as we record this, but rest assured I am live with you in the chat function as you're viewing this. So let's get going. I want to cover today the New York Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, CPA, how that feeds into our carbon neutral buildings roadmap, how that interacts with Passive House, and a second document called the Building Electrification Roadmap, closely related. And then if we have some time, get into a few of NYSERDA's existing programs and strategies that we are launching to aggressively decarbonize buildings. In case anybody is not familiar with NYSERDA, we're New York State's Energy Research and Development Authority. And in a nutshell, we are looking to accelerate the transition of New York State's clean energy economy. So in case anybody needs to be reminded why this is so important, the high performance building world, there are just myriad articles out there, scientific studies demonstrating that the kind of catastrophic consequences of unmitigated climate change. And I think this is an interesting statement. It came from the IPCC report in October 2018. And it really, I want to say something about it. This is before COVID. And if COVID has done anything, it has shown us that the world actually can respond in a relatively coordinated and aggressive manner to address a pressing threat. And imagine if that coordination were actually applied to climate change. We can actually fix this. I would also note that think about 1920, the 3 decades between 1920 and 1950 and the transformation of the US and major economies around the world. That was a massive transformation in just 3 decades and all done with slide rules. There were no computers. So we actually can address this problem. What we need is political will. We don't have any of that in the federal government right now with respect to climate change. In fact, they're actively pushing in the opposite direction. But there's some positive news, and that's at the state level. So I just want to run through what's happened in the last year. This is a graphic from March 2019. I'll quickly explain the colors, and then I'll run through this. This is about states that have adopted or introduced a 100% clean electricity requirement, either clean or renewable. Dark green means that they've passed legislation. Light green means legislation's been introduced. Orange means legislation is anticipated. In the blue, you'll see light blue come up, which means an executive order is introduced, and dark blue, like New Jersey there, is executive order enacted. So the state of the country in March 2019, you got 4 jurisdictions, California, Hawaii, Washington, D.C., that have passed legislation, and New Jersey has passed an executive order. So let's see what happens in the course of a year. Washington passes legislation. Nevada passes legislation. Colorado introduces an executive order. New Mexico passes legislation. Wisconsin introduces an executive order. Maine introduces legislation. Pennsylvania introduces legislation. North Carolina introduces an executive order. Puerto Rico passes legislation. Iowa introduces. Colorado enacts its executive order. Wisconsin enacts its executive order. Maine passes legislation. Vermont introduces legislation. Florida introduces legislation. You guys starting to see a trend here? Virginia passes legislation. Connecticut and Rhode Island introduce executive orders. Oregon introduces legislation. Arizona, we're seeing red states, blue states, purple states. North Carolina introduces legislation. Maryland and Michigan introduced legislation. And finally, there's New York bouncing in review. A little out of sequence for the dramatic effect there, but New York passed 100% clean electricity legislation last year. So we now have 14 states. In just over a year, we got 10 more. And if we didn't have the current situation, I'm sure other states would be moving in this direction. So the states get it. The states understand that a clean grid is critical to building electrification to make progress on climate change. So New York State's legislation is the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, passed by the legislation last summer and signed by the governor into law in the fall. It is very aggressive. Bottom line is a carbon neutral economy-wide goal for the middle of the century, with a specific greenhouse gas reduction target of at least 85% by 2050, below 1990 levels, shooting for higher, but potentially using offsets for the last 15%. On the way, you've got a 40% greenhouse gas reduction target for 2030. And as mentioned, the important part of the carbon-free grid, 100% clean electricity by 2040, 70% renewable electricity by 2030. The difference there is real. It allows nuclear to stay in a mix for 2040 if the plants are still operating in New York State. Also sets some specific technology targets. A big investment coming in offshore wind by New York. We've already had our first procurement last year and working on our second, but we're looking for 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035, 3 gigawatts of energy storage by 2030, 6,000 megawatts of PV, rooftop PV by 2025, a big energy efficiency codification. I'll get to that a little bit later. And important point here, this is a job creator, 151,000 clean energy jobs. I believe that figure was at the end of 2018, got to 170,000 by the end of 2019 in New York State. Struggling these days, and NYSERDA is trying to help clean energy companies survive this current situation. So the law creates an entity called the Climate Action Council, which is in charge of developing the plan to reach these targets. It's co-chaired by NYSERDA and by the Department of Environmental Conservation, and then it's made up of roughly half and half relevant agency heads and gubernatorial and legislative appointments. There are a few advisory panels. They're on the right of the screen. The important one for our work is housing and energy efficiency, and that doesn't mean just energy efficiency and housing. It means those two topics separately. There's a timeline here is that these are all as of January of those years. So looking for the first draft of this economy-wide scoping plan by the beginning of 2022, with another year to take that draft to final form. So by January 1, 2023, the final scoping plan should be in place, and statewide regulations will be in place by 2024. One of the tasks of the Climate Action Council is to describe the costs and benefits of this transition. And a lot of people will ask, does it cost too much? And I think that's entirely the wrong question. Coronavirus costs too much. Unmitigated climate change, inaction will cost too much. And these are pure costs because society doesn't get a benefit for the billions of dollars that we are spending or incurring in economic contraction fighting these issues. We need to be thinking about the money that is invested in this clean energy transition as just that. They are investments. We are making investments in critical long-term assets, the grid and our building stock. And there would have been billions of dollars invested to maintain these assets just in the business as usual course. So the right question is, okay, what is the incremental cost of making those investments in the right way so that we're aligned and working toward carbon neutrality by 2050? You know, what's the incremental cost of that over business as usual? And more importantly, what can government do while it's accelerating the transition to minimize that incremental cost? How can we get that down? Critically important. And the other important point is that we need to figure out how to share those costs and the benefits equitably. I'm recording this in the time of major protests in New York City, around the country, about racial and economic injustice. And it really highlights how important the environmental justice agenda is and the need for fairness as we transition to clean energy economy to make that an inclusive transition. So the CLCPA sets a floor of at least 35% of the overall benefits of spending on this clean energy transition, and our programs go to disadvantaged communities with a target of 40% of those benefits going to disadvantaged communities. And there are a couple of different subgroups under the CLCPA beyond those advisory groups that I mentioned that are focused on these issues: just transition for the workforce, environmental justice, and definition of disadvantaged communities. At the same time, New York City also passed major legislation last year called the Climate Mobilization Act. And the most important part of that is Local Law 97, at least the most relevant to this conversation, which actually puts a cap on greenhouse gas emissions from buildings over 25,000 square feet in New York City. And that the first compliance period is 2024, not extremely stringent, looking at the lowest performers, but the next cap in 2030 is substantially lower, and the cap lowers every 5 years after 2030, getting to an 80% reduction by 2050. As I mentioned, the CLCPA codified a big energy efficiency program called No Efficiency New York, achieving those results enough to power 1.8 million New York homes by 2025. But importantly, this delivers 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions reductions needed to meet our 2030 goal of that 40% reduction. That's great, but that's only a small piece of where we need to get to. So we really need to get much further and get to carbon neutrality. So both CLCPA and the city's legislation require that we get to carbon neutrality. So NYSERDA is leading the development of a roadmap to get our building stock there. So let's step back for a second. What do we mean by a carbon neutral building stock? What's a carbon neutral building? If we decarbonize our grid and then electrify buildings, are we there? Well, technically maybe, but if we just do that on top of the load that is on the buildings today, we would really overwhelm our grid. We'd transition from a summer to a winter peaking grid, and the winter peak would be, there's lots of different estimates here, but substantially higher than the current summer peak. So in combination, we need to focus on efficiency. We need to focus on envelopes. That's where Passive House and similar high performance standards come in. And we need to be responsive to grid conditions, meaning that making buildings flexible in their load management. So incorporating storage, it could be batteries, it could be thermal, it could be phase change materials, but ways that buildings can manage their loads to shift their loads away from peak. And then while we're doing this, we also need to pay attention to embodied carbon that is in the building stock or in the materials that are being used to build the buildings or retrofit the buildings, as well as the global warming potential of refrigerants. So it's there's a lot to get through. The roadmap is looking for pathways to achieve carbon neutrality, and we're starting with 4 sectors: the single family, multifamily, residential, office, and academic, higher education sectors. This is a living roadmap, and we will publish addendums to it every 5 years or so, taking a look at different building typologies and adjusting to market and technological changes over those 5-year periods. And so what we're doing is a bunch of modeling to figure out what is realistic in terms of adoption of various conservation measures and penetration into the market cost and impact on the electric grid. We have been engaging stakeholders. We've had 13 different sessions. The last one was yesterday on embodied carbon. Gotten a lot of great feedback from a lot of experts in the field. The idea here is to send a long-term market signal to the real estate sector, which says, look, if you're building a building today or doing major renovations or just implementing your capital plan, you need to be thinking about carbon neutrality, because if you don't, you're building something that will be obsolete within a very short period of time. And don't forget that it's not just about energy savings. There's a lot of health, comfort, productivity. That's not lost on the passive house community. Everybody listening to this probably understands how important that is. And also if there are resilience benefits here. So we got to cover new construction. Codes are very important there, but we've got to cover existing buildings, and that's a harder task because at least 3/4, if not 85, 90% of buildings that will exist in 2050 already exist today. So we got to figure out how to get at those buildings either comprehensively, if you're doing a large renovation, or through a phased capital plan as you're replacing assets when they reach the end of their useful life. Lots of things we're covering in the roadmap. Just the definitions that we talked about, business case, value proposition, electrification, again, central strategy. So we'll be thinking about technology. What do we need? What's out there? What are the limits to electrification? Where do we need to be thinking about renewable fuels, biomass, and renewable natural gas? There will be a lot on policy, resilience, and importantly, what's next? What don't we know? What do we need to know to advance as quickly as we can? We're looking to wrap up the first draft this summer, take a presentation out probably virtually to a broader stakeholder community, get comments back, integrate them all, more research coming in with the goal of publishing by the end of the first quarter of 2021. Why only one roadmap when we can do two, right? But building electrification is such an important part of this path that we're doing a separate companion document that we hope to release at the same time. It's being led by Vanessa Ulmer at NYSERDA. And the point is, electrification means a bunch of things. We can reduce the summer electric peak. It's an important alternative today to gas supply constrained areas, which are growing in magnitude and political consequences in New York State, and also just for healthier homes. So the electrification roadmap has a bit of a different timeline. It's really looking at 2030 and saying, okay, well, you've got this broader document that sets out the vision for 2050. starts to give you some steps on the path. But for electrification, where do we need to be in 2030 to be on this path to 2050 carbon neutrality? And what are the gaps? How do we fill them? And what are the recommended directions for public policies and programs to make that all happen? So I got a few more minutes to talk about NYSERDA programs and strategies that we have today to move in the direction of carbon neutrality. You know, we are not waiting for these roadmaps to get finished and published to take action. We have lots of programs, and there's been I'd say a very meaningful transition in NYSERDA from, you know, pushing for incremental energy efficiency to kind of going all in on, all right, well, we've got to go further. We've got to be pushing for net zero carbon, net zero energy. And of course, Passive House is a really powerful strategy in that direction. So I want to talk briefly about Retrofit New York, which I think is an exciting program trying to stimulate net zero retrofit industry. And just point out that on the 15th of July, there is a session under this Passive House conference, specifically on Retrofit New York. So if you're interested, tune into that one. Buildings of Excellence, a new construction competition, and there's a program on buildings of excellence in this Passive House conference on the 29th of July. And then a host of other programs there, codes, trying to take the codes to a place where they require a zero carbon construction, hopefully by the end of this decade. Let's look at Retrofit New York for a minute. It's adapting a successful model that has been running in the Netherlands called Energy Sprong, which means energy leap. And the house on the right has undergone an Energy Sprong renovation, and it is now net zero energy. So what did that mean? What it is really it's wrapping an existing building with a highly insulated prefabricated shell. So the windows are already baked into the shell in the factory, then shipped to the site or trucked to the site and attached to the building. Same thing with the roof, with panels integrated into the roof, and then you can downsize mechanical systems, try to integrate them and sort of plug and play with this type of envelope, high performance envelope. And then adding grid interactivity is important here too. I talked about cost reduction, mentioned it earlier. This is a primary focus of this work, is that when you can get carbon neutral building retrofits at cost parity with business as usual, that's when the private sector is going to say, okay, because we get that the carbon neutral retrofits actually bring more value than just this comparing the initial cost. So that engages private sector capital, and we get we get investment and scale in this industry. So you may think, he's going backwards, but actually I meant to do this. Is when we hear folks from Energy Sprong talk about their program, and Jasper uses this slide, and he says, okay, there's the buildings, but really it's about the cars. And what he means is, think about the transition in the automobile industry over the last century. The amount of value that's in that car today versus the Model T, and it's really at cost parity given the inflation over time. So how did we get there in the automobile industry? Well, that's industrialized, standardized process. Everything is working together into this industrial situation. So you have these chassis come out, and the whole supply chain is working directed toward that. The whole customer experience, sales and maintenance, it's all integrated and working along, this one assembly line that can put out, 40, 50 different versions of that when you think about the different trims, the different engines, the different colors, but it's all based on this one system. We don't do that in construction, and we need to reinvent construction. That's what Energy Sprong is doing. That's actually what McKinsey says is an extremely attractive opportunity. Interestingly, this study came out from McKinsey after Energy Sprong was already working on their program. But the point is, productivity in the construction industry has been flat or actually declining over the last, this is 20 years, but it actually goes all the way back to the 60s. There are a number of reasons for that, but every project in construction is generally bespoke. It's a different thing. It's a snowflake. So while the rest of the world is figuring out how to get more from less, the construction industry has not been. So take a look at this slide. There is enormous opportunity in prefabrication. And look at the bottom numbers there, 5 to 10 times productivity boost. That's not going to work for all building types. We're not saying put a new facade on every building in the country, but it's going to work for a lot of buildings. And that's why we're so focused on it. So here's your conventional process. It's very labor intensive on site. These people are applying EFIS to the exterior of a building. Here's the new way. This is a controlled environment in the factory. They're making these panels extremely high performance, air sealed, well insulated, air sealed around the window connections, and then they're trucked on the site, attached to the building. Same thing for mechanical system. This was a first generation mechanical system for one of these Energy Sprong retrofits. Looks a little Rube Goldberg-ish. It's got all the right things, but they're just sort of thrown together. And this is where we're headed. This is where they've gotten to in Europe, where you have very compact, contained. You got all of your mechanical systems in those different boxes. One's a channel on the right there, and then these other two can attach from the outside. And so it's truly plug and play. And that's where you can see the cost compression, and it's been proven out by Energy Sprong. So they are doing buildings today, and they've completed at least 15,000 of these. So they're starting to get to meaningful scale. And they're now producing them today at roughly 40% of the cost of their initial pilots. So they've had a 60% decline in the cost, and that comes through learning. It comes through increased demand, transparency, and scale. So that's really where we need to go. Tune in July 15th. Buildings of Excellence is a design competition for multifamily buildings. And we have now gone through the second phase. We had the first round of Buildings of Excellence, I believe, made 28 awards. It was really successful. Lots of applications, lots of great projects. Now we have had the submissions come in, just closed at the end of May for round 2, and there will be a round 3 as well. The idea is to award aggressive designs for net zero passive house level projects. Sorry, I haven't updated the bottom of that slide. It was actually May 27th. But anyway, we're looking for electrification, deep efficiency, on-site generation, and also storage and smart systems. And round 2 actually was the first place to ask for embodied carbon information in applications. So we're starting to pay a lot more attention to that as well. This is a picture of Net Zero Village in Rotterdam, very successful low energy project. So stretch code, critical. New York City has adopted NYSERDA's stretch code, and it became effective last month. That's exciting. This is dramatically improving or increasing the energy efficiency requirements in new buildings. And as I mentioned, trying to take the codes to 0 by the end of this decade. Also have awards for community scale planning and design. This is through the Net Zero Energy for Economic Development program. It has a community scale category, and NYU won an award last year. These awards are up to $5 million for thinking through how do you get an entire campus to carbon neutrality. Same thing at University at Albany, Uptown, another award winner under that program. Category A under net zero energy for economic development is for individual buildings that are economic development opportunities. Okay. And this is an award winner from Pelham. That program is still going as well. And then we have lots of other incentive programs. This is low-rise residential new construction. It's a net zero energy home built by Green Hill Contracting. Here's a low-rise residential apartment building in Brooklyn, Passive House Institute certified. Lots of others out there. I'm out of time. Really appreciate your attention today, and now turn it over to Shylin.
Hello and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm very pleased to be presenting a brief update on some recent work in the City of Vancouver to advance zero emissions buildings. My name is Shylin Black. I'm a senior green building planner at the City of Vancouver, and my work is focused on changes to the zoning and development process to try to improve the adoption of zero emissions buildings. I graduated from architecture school in 1993, back when there was relatively little attention paid to the energy efficiency of buildings. This was more than clear based on the building itself. I was in a building called the NYSERDA building, which was designed back in 1962. And back then they thought jalousie windows would be an awesome feature for a building, I guess visually. But in the wintertime in Vancouver, jalousie windows, little slats of glass in a frame, don't work so well, I can tell you. I had a desk right next to them, and I thought, we could probably do better than this. I did have the great fortune of having as one of my professors, Ray Cole, one of the leading lights in better building design and efficiency from an early point, and I really responded to the enthusiasm that he brought to the subject. I eventually became an intern architect in private practice, and in the course of doing that, I had to negotiate all of the City of Vancouver's what felt like a giant thicket of planning regulations and policies. And I was also charged with drawing up wall assemblies. So I got to know the details of these things pretty well in private practice. I was then asked to join the City of Vancouver as a development planner, where I basically was just moving around to the other side of the desk and applying the same regulations and policies that I was trying to interpret before. And most recently, I've been invited to join the green building team here at the City of Vancouver that is resolutely focused on building better buildings, which is great. But they were looking for somebody with a bit of experience in zoning regulation, and that turned out to be me. So now I'm on, maybe it's the third side of the desk at this point. I'm actually writing the regulations with a team to try to remove barriers to better buildings and get at the nuts and bolts of better envelopes, and possibly even, in some cases, actual incentives to do these better buildings. So I've posed a couple of questions here, and I hope to share some of our latest policies and incentives that try to make these kind of projects easier and more attractive to build, especially a very recent and significant update to the building code and a new streamlined approach for 1- and 2-family homes. So I'm not going to tell you about all of our policies. That would take a few hours. I'll focus on those two. Just by way of context or outline, this presentation is in 4 different parts. I'm going to quickly go through the Vancouver context, just so you know what our context is we're operating in. I'm going to look at a couple of recent green building policies, and I'll tell you about those 2 new policies as well. And we'll even look at some recent projects at different scales, much as Greg was able to share with us. So first, the context. Why does any of this matter in Vancouver, and how did we get here as a city? So it's worth noting right away that we've had for some time some pretty significant targets for zero emissions buildings. The goal of having all new buildings built to a zero emission standard by 2030 has been in place for a few years. And by zero emissions, by the way, we mean about 3 kilograms CO2 equivalent per square meter per year or less. I don't know how that translates into imperial units, but maybe it's 10 ounces a square foot or something like that. The question is also, why do we focus on buildings so much? So Vancouver, unlike other jurisdictions, has relatively little heavy manufacturing. And the consequence is that most of our carbon is emitted by our buildings. It's just heating and cooling the buildings and providing the hot water for them. 2.4 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So a fairly significant load to the atmosphere. The basic document that the green building team, at least for my work, is based on is a very good report back in 2016 called the Zero Emissions Building Plan. And one of the neat things this plan did was to set out 4 different strategies to try to get to those near zero buildings by 2030. First, I think also similar to New York, we committed to walk the walk. If we were going to build new buildings for city facilities, we were going to go for zero emissions buildings for our own work. We were also going to try to catalyze those early adopters, those voluntary champions that were out there. Back in 2014, they were 2015, fairly few and far between. The image up on your screen here is one of the very first, if not the first, passive house in Vancouver by DLP Architecture. And this was a bright architect who took on the challenge himself for his own project and did a great job with it. One of the first buildings in Vancouver. We also tried to build capacity in expertise. So that's the consultants and the builders and everybody who has to make these buildings work on the ground. And we're also moving to set actual performance-based emissions limits. So how does passive house fit into this? I'll say right away, it's not about the specific metrics necessarily. It's not about 0.6 air changes per hour or 0.05 cubic feet per minute. Our experience has been that just adopting the passive house standard and people taking that on has produced a great training tool for doing better buildings in general. It gives you clear control standards and checks through the process. It tells you as a new builder or new designer everything you need to know about efficient building design. And our experience has been it attracts some great builders and designers, people who are bright and keen and willing to take on these things. It also holds everybody accountable. There's pretty clear performance metrics as you go along, and those things help with everybody's clarity and transparency. We also found we could translate some of the lessons from individual buildings and people's practices into wider policy and practices. Recently, the province, that's the province of British Columbia, so that's comparable to the state government, has been moving away from prescriptive-based building codes. They started to offer back in 2017 a performance-based code for new buildings. For houses, there were 5 different steps of achievement, with the 5 being net zero energy ready or very similar to a passive house level. They varied the requirements by climate zones so that people in extreme northern BC didn't have to hit the same energy metrics necessarily, so it was a little bit tailored. And they set out specific metrics: air changes less than 1 per hour, mechanical use less than 25 kilowatt hours per year, thermal less than 15 kilowatt hours per year, which may look fairly familiar in terms of metrics to hit. I think those are very similar to passive house in North America. In 2018, we started to have our first actual incentive programs, and I'll get to that in a sec. But we did have tools on both sides of the scale, from detached housing, 1 and 2 family dwellings, up to multifamily, and the policies go on from here. I'm not showing you the whole range of policies. There's high building policies, there's rezoning policies, but just for the purpose of today, I'll just show you this little range that we've got here. And by the way, I'll quickly throw out a shout out to the designers of the building on the left-hand side. That's by Cornerstone Architecture, working with 8th Avenue Development, one of the first multifamily passive houses that showed people in Vancouver, including Vancouver's council and mayor at the time, that it was possible to do very high performance building at the multifamily scale. And I think that was one that helped turn the corner from passive house being perceived as a specialized tool for single family houses to something broader that could be applied more widely. That's 85 units, by the way. We also benefited from interest and cooperation with the province. So the Near Zero Incentive Program was co-sponsored by the City of Vancouver and the province of BC. It offered a fairly decent amount of actual cash. Now, that cash didn't come from the City of Vancouver, but we helped sponsor the program overall. And this is for people who are doing detached housing in the Lower Mainland. And if they were hitting passive house and they had electric source heating, they could access this funding up to $23,000. It's been quite helpful. That image on the right, by the way, is designed by architect Nick Bray, single family house on a fairly tight lot. And it might be nearing completion now, so we may follow up on that one and find out how they've done. Also in 2018, we saw the very first actual incentive offered by the City of Vancouver directly. So unlike the provincial sponsored program, this one was us. This was the City of Vancouver. And we, with Council's approval, brought out a program whereby we were able to offer an increase in floor space to projects pursuing passive house or equivalent standards in multifamily housing. And without going through a rezoning. So it's a much faster process. And folks can see what they would be getting in return for taking on passive house. And I'm happy to see we've had a number of projects since then come forward. The big shift, I think, politically in terms of the urgency and the desire to really take on a whole gamut of programs to advance zero emissions buildings probably came with 2019 when our council declared a climate emergency, much as many cities around the world did at a similar time in response to the IPCC report that Greg mentioned. We brought forward a whole range of programs, and I'm just going to talk about two of them today. And I'm going to talk about the heating hot water systems going to zero emissions within about 5 years, which is quite a pace. And I'm going to talk about some improved floor space incentives for zero emissions detached housing. So first of all, the code change, and I continue to be impressed by this. This was brought out by a whole team on the code and the green building team side, but it basically set out a requirement in the building code, not as an incentive program, not as a voluntary measure, but in the code for zero emission space and hot water heating. It also set out improved building envelope metrics for roofs and windows and air leakage. It also brought people an option to go to step 4 metrics, and it tightened the performance of various building components. The other one, now this one is a voluntary measure or an incentive measure, was in response to some challenges that have been identified to us by different green building practitioners at the 1 and 2 family scale. One of them was that although our zoning bylaw had a whole raft of exclusions and variances designed to accommodate green buildings, including passive house, they were pretty complicated. So I alluded to that thicket of regulations that the applicant or designer sees. So from a customer's perspective, although there's tools out there to help them do green buildings, they can be complicated. They can require multiple calculations on different levels. Just as a gory example, I invite you to try to read our former bylaw 1033.2 that says, the Director of Planning can exclude an area equal to the area occupied by the insulation thickness that exceeds the applicable thermal performance value for the exterior walls in the building bylaw. So that's a mouthful in and of itself, but just pause for a minute. It's not telling you you can exclude the area of the exclusion of the, it's got me going, area of insulation that exceeds the code based on the insulation. It's now based on the whole performance of the wall. So you end up having to prorate a portion of the insulation relative to how much the wall's overall performance exceeds the minimum requirements in the code. And you'll have to do that for each different assembly that you have in the building. Needless to say, we thought that could be simplified a little. And that was just one of the multiple exclusions. The other exciting thing was that when council gave staff the directive to explore this, they said that new approach could include a modest incentive. And that was kind of a new thing. We didn't have any actual incentives for 1 and 2 family houses before. As we took on the kind of challenge from this council motion, we discovered pretty quickly there were a few challenges and there were a few potential solutions. Some of the interests that we had to address were in equity. Now, Greg noted equity is a component of New York's programs, maybe no less so here in the City of Vancouver. So we had to give thought to how that might be reflected in these. We also knew that there was a parallel interest in preserving character and heritage houses. So as we brought forward this program, we had to think about how these things might work alongside, or at best, not have one overwhelm the other. So we're looking for some sort of parity there. And finally, there's the unsexy problem of administration. How do you actually administer a new rule or regulation that you bring out? Who checks it? Who verifies it? What does it mean as a customer to try to use this product? We got lucky early on. We started doing our research, and one of the first things we noticed in looking at 1 and 2 family houses was that as you got into a duplex unit, you typically needed a second HRV unit. You needed it because most people aren't going to move into a duplex and share a common air handling system. They want their own system, which is reasonable. Fire separations also weigh on that decision to go to 2 separate HRVs. There was an existing HRV exclusion, which we were intending to roll into this kind of all-in-one approach, the simplified approach. And so pretty quickly, it was obvious that we should be offering a higher exclusion rate for the duplex project because of the space taken up by that mechanical than for the single family. That also means that as people are doing 2-family housing, which is somewhat more affordable form of housing than single family on a detached lot, they were also able to access a higher incentive, which did help with equity to a small degree. I would also note that this wasn't the first incentive program we brought out. The very first program we brought out was for multifamily housing. This is the second one where we're now turning to this form. We also tested the realism of offering an incentive. Could we accommodate it within the zoning that we had now? Our zoning bylaw has multiple envelopes and restrictions on how big houses and duplexes can get. So we hired an outside firm of architects to test our thinking. They identified for us a kind of upper limit of in terms of how much incentive we could add on to the existing exclusions and still fit within the existing zoning. And fortunately for us, and we got lucky a second time here, the limit they identified meant that the amount of the incentive did not overwhelm the existing incentives for character house retention. So we were able to say, as we went forward to the character and heritage advocates out there, that this wasn't a program that was going to swamp the interests of character preservation as well. We wound up with a very simple approach. If you came in with a passive house, you would enjoy a 16% exclusion from floor space for a 1-family dwelling and an 18% for 2-family. That does include a modest increase in the permitted built floor area above and beyond the current exclusion. So that was the incentive. We also broadened the approach a little bit to include other comparable third-party standards, just to make sure that if there was some peculiarity of the site or the design that made passive house a challenge, that folks could access a comparable program. And I'm very happy to say that was approved by council in February of this year. And we're quite happy to see it. And we've got a large number of practitioners out there interested to learn more, and we'll be holding workshops about that soon. We hope what it means for the designer is that their lives are a little bit simplified, at least in terms of dealing with the zoning bylaw. They need to do just one calculation instead of multiple calculations. It also means that when staff are dealing with these applications, and this is the administration side, that there's only one calculation that they need to check in this regard. So we're hoping this makes everybody's lives a little simpler. It is a time-limited increase in area because we know that the codes are catching up constantly, and I did mention the zero emissions piece that we also just passed. So we're kind of working both sides of the equation and trying to bring the codes along at the same time that we're improving our voluntary measures. Just a quick note, this is a project by one of our local practitioners, Lane Fab, and a very sharp designer named Brent Davidson. Has done multiple projects at the Passive House Standard in Vancouver. This particular one, I think Windsor Street Passive House, it's about 2,700 square feet. And I will say in passing, and without naming names, one of the things we got lucky with in general in Vancouver is we do have a contingent of fairly sharp designers who tell us where they're encountering the problems, what the challenges are, what some of the solutions might be. And we have the benefit of being able to steal their ideas and sometimes incorporate them into policy. So just a shout out to all the guys who are doing the hard work for us. You know who you are. In terms of outcomes, how have we done? Well, I'll be the first to say that these are a a small percentage of the overall volume of general construction that's out there, but we're still very happy to say we've got around 4 million square feet of projects at different stages of inquiry and application that are going for a zero emission standard. And that's largely passive house, but that does also include some projects under the International Living Future standards. That also includes some projects under net zero standards, and they're all moving in the right direction. We actually have approvals for in excess of 1 million square feet. And in terms of projects that are being built and on the ground, we're north of 300,000 square feet. So lots of examples for us to learn from, lots of learning that's happening in the industry, and lots of knowledge sharing that's going on as a result of this volume. I'm going to show you just a few projects that are on the ground examples and outcomes of some of the programs that I've mentioned. So on the left-hand side, that's actually a triplex, and it's a renovation. Really challenging project, but still a passive house by our local designer, Brian Billingsley, or rather an architect. And on the right-hand side, you're seeing that image, I think, again, Main Street Passive House by Nick Bray. Worth mentioning, in addition to going for a passive house, this is also a very small lot, 25 feet wide. And I think they also had subsurface soil water issues, which they had to deal with. But on top of all that, they're still plowing ahead with passive house, which is fantastic. And I think they're even planning on trying to break some records on their air sealing. So they're going for very, very low air changes per hour in their air seal tests. So we wish them luck and hope that is resolved by the time you're hearing this. Up at the medium scale, I mentioned before, we do have local architects who've done a good volume of multifamily housing, Cornerstone Architects and Scott Kennedy. And this is a relatively recent project, the Narrows, I think on East Hastings Street. This is 45 secured market rentals over top of a retail at the base as a passive house design. A number of the features that they're trying out there include automated exterior shading, which is a neat one. I don't think we've seen that on a recent building, although it's been used previously on some Olympic Village projects. Individual interior mechanical measures like double insulated lines for the hot water system. And this project was also one of the winners in a recent Net Zero Energy Ready Challenge that was put on by the province of BC, another one of their Clean BC programs that are aimed at making buildings in general in BC less polluting and more comfortable and more energy efficient. So we're seeing the combination of city initiatives, provincial initiatives, all coming together here in multifamily housing. That's rental. It's not just condos. This is everyday rental housing that's being built. And then at the much larger scale, we have a pair of high-rise projects that I think are worth mentioning. 1075 Nelson Street on the left by local architects IBI Group. This is 60 stories of passive house construction in excess of 400,000 square feet and about 485 dwelling units. That will contain both strata units for sale and non-market rental units. And that's headed for consideration by our city council quite soon. I hope that one goes ahead as well. On the right-hand side on Alberni Street, a pair of towers, the taller one at 48 stories. This is in excess of 600,000 square feet of development. 2 different towers on a common podium, 578 strata and rental units, and a childcare facility on that podium base. So a complex building program, and they are also going for a passive house. I'm going to wrap up shortly, but I will say, although you've heard my voice talking, there's a big team of folks at the Green Building team here at the City of Vancouver, all of whom are working on their individual speciality, all of whom are advancing better buildings in Vancouver. So I'm going to leave that up there just for a second. And I've included their email addresses. They're probably going to get me later for doing that, but I just wanted you to know if you have specific questions, and if you can't reach me, and I'm going to throw up my email address on the last slide, you could try shooting them an email. You could be pleasantly surprised by the response you get. But it's a great team. I'm lucky to be working with them. That's it for my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you to Greg for his presentation.